6.1 Denmark's geography. The Danish landscape has been shaped by the ice ages, which on several occasions completely covered the area that today makes up Denmark. The ice melted around 11,500 years ago. Denmark is one of the lowest lying countries in the world. On average, Denmark's land area lies 34 meters above sea level. The highest natural point is called Møllehøj and is located in eastern Jutland, about 170 meters above sea level. Denmark covers an area of approximately 43,000 square kilometers and is mostly covered by fertile clay and sandy soil, although in some places the landscape is very different. On the eastern side of the island of Møn, for example, there is an almost 130-meter high cliff, Møns Klint. The island of Bornholm and the Ertelmene archipelago, located in the Baltic Sea, also differ from the rest of the landscape. These islands are the only places in Denmark where the bedrock is visible. Denmark was previously covered by forest, but today about 60% of the country is cultivated land. Denmark consists of a peninsula, Jutland, and 443 named islands. However, people live on only about 80 of the Danish islands. The rest are small and uninhabited. The largest island is Zealand. South of Zealand lie the islands of Lolland and Falster. Because of the many islands, Denmark has a very long coastline, about 7,300 kilometers, and nowhere in Denmark is more than 52 kilometers from the sea. The North Sea is the largest of the seas surrounding Denmark. It lies off the west coast of Jutland and is also called the West Sea. North of Zealand and Funen lies the Kattegat, which is connected to the Baltic Sea to the south by the three straits, the Little Belt, the Great Belt, and the Øresund. Only in southern Jutland, the southernmost part of Jutland, is there a land border, 68 kilometers long, with a neighboring country, namely Germany. The climate in Denmark is mainly influenced by its location near the North Sea and the short distance to the coast throughout the country. From the Gulf of Mexico, a continuous current of warm water, the so-called Gulf Stream, is carried toward northern Europe. Because of the Gulf Stream, the climate in northwestern Europe, especially in winter, is significantly milder than in other places in the world at the same latitude, such as Moscow or southern Alaska. The coldest months, January and February, have an average daytime temperature of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, while the warmest months, July and August, average about 22 degrees. However, temperatures can be both significantly colder and warmer. The lowest temperature ever recorded in Denmark is minus 31.2 degrees Celsius in 1982, while the highest is 36.4 degrees Celsius in 1975. Today, Denmark is connected by several bridges and tunnels. In 1935, the first bridge over the Little Belt between Jutland and Funen was inaugurated, and in 1970, another Little Belt bridge opened. In 1997, the Great Belt fixed link between Funen and Zealand opened for rail traffic, and the following year, in 1998, for road traffic. In 2000, the Øresund fixed link created a permanent connection across the Øresund Strait between Zealand and the neighboring country Sweden. Denmark's capital and largest city is Copenhagen, located in the eastern part of Zealand. Today, about 1/3 of Denmark's population lives in the metropolitan area, that is, in Copenhagen itself and the municipalities surrounding it. Aarhus, about 300,000 inhabitants, is the largest city in Jutland. It is located on the east coast of Jutland and is Denmark's second largest city. The largest city on Funen is Odense, about 200,000 inhabitants, which is the country's third largest city. Denmark's fourth largest city is Aalborg, about 125,000 inhabitants, located in North Jutland. The fifth largest is Esbjerg, about 75,000 inhabitants, in West Jutland. In recent years, Denmark's most important raw materials have been the oil and natural gas found beneath the seabed in the Danish part of the North Sea. Since the late 1990s, Denmark has exported more energy than it has imported. The extraction of oil and natural gas has therefore been of relatively great importance to the Danish economy, although its significance has been declining. In December 2020, the Danish parliament decided to end this production no later than 2050. This decision is due in part to a desire for a green transition to renewable energy. 6.2 Denmark's sites. A large number of Danish and foreign tourists choose to spend their holidays in Denmark every year. According to Denmark's National Tourism Organization, Visit Denmark, 66 million overnight stays were recorded in Denmark in 2024 at hotels, hostels, holiday centers, campsites, and holiday homes. Of these, Danes accounted for 31 million, while Germany was by far the largest foreign market with 21 million overnight stays. The vast majority of overnight stays take place in coastal areas, where tourists primarily come to experience Danish nature. The West Sea, the North Sea, in particular, attracts many tourists. Danish and foreign tourists in Denmark spent a total of 152 billion Danish kroner in 2022. Many tourists also choose to see and experience a number of Denmark's attractions, including the 7 sites that are listed on UNESCO's World Heritage List, the UN Organization for Education, Culture, Communication, and Science. These may include buildings or natural areas that are of exceptional importance to the entire world. This section focuses on some of Denmark's most important sites. Skagen. Skagen's Green is the northernmost point of Denmark. Here, the 2 seas, Skagerrak and Kattegat, meet. This means that you can stand with 1 foot in each sea and watch the waves collide. In 1795, the church south of the town had to be closed because it was buried by the large amounts of sand that blew in over it. All that remains today is the tower of the buried church as a monument to the enormous forces of nature. In the period from around 1875 to 1910, Skagen was an international summer meeting place for painters such as Anna Encher, Michael Encher, and P.S. Krøyer. They were searching for new motifs, which they found in Skagen in the form of the fishermen and their hard lives, as well as the special light reflected by the bright beaches and the sea on both sides. Most of the Skagen painters' major works can be seen at the Skagens Museum. Tirpitz and the Atlantic Wall. Near Blåvand, close to Esbjerg in western Jutland, the Nazi occupying forces began constructing Battery Vogelnest, Bird's Nest Battery, also called Tirpitz, in 1944. It consisted of 2 enormous gun bunkers. They were intended to form part of the massive defensive system known as the Atlantic Wall, which the Germans planned to build along the entire European Atlantic coast. Denmark's location by the North Sea made the country part of this defensive system against a possible Allied invasion. As a result, many bunkers were built and landmines were laid along the entire west coast of Jutland from 1942 onwards. Tirpitz was intended to defend the approach to the west coast's only major city, Esbjerg, with artillery capable of firing up to 55 kilometers. However, the bunker was never completed before Denmark's liberation in May 1945. After the war, Danish engineering troops unsuccessfully attempted to blow it up. As a result, it, and many other German bunkers, still stand today as reminders of the occupation period in the dramatic dune landscape of the West Coast. Tirpitz opened as a museum in 2017. A tunnel connects the concrete of the new architecture with the old gun bunker, whose reinforced concrete walls are more than 3 meters thick. Den Gamle By, the Old Town, parts of the Market Town Museum in Aarhus, known as Den Gamle By, form a model of a small Danish town as it might have looked in the 19th century. It consists of about 75 buildings that have been reconstructed from all over Denmark. The reconstructed houses date from the period 1550 to 1900, and the museum has gradually expanded with 3 newer districts featuring houses and shops from the past 100 years. As a result, parts of Den Gamle By also show what a Danish town looked like from 1927 to 2014. Moesgaard Museum. The spectacular museum building from 2014, designed by Henning Larsen Architects in collaboration with Christine Jensen's studio, is located just south of Aarhus. The museum's exhibitions mainly contain finds from Denmark's prehistoric periods, the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age, as well as from the Viking Age. Among the exhibits is the Graubal Man, the world's best preserved bog body. Around 290 BC, during the Iron Age, his throat was cut. The remarkable preservation of the body is due to the chemical processes in the bog in eastern Jutland where he was placed. At the time of his death, he was 34 years old and was most likely sacrificed to a god believed to dwell in the depths of the bog. The Wadden Sea. The Wadden Sea, which follows the coast from the northern Netherlands through Germany and up to Blåvandshuk in southwestern Jutland, is 500 kilometers long. It is the world's largest continuous tidal flat landscape and one of the 10 most important wetlands in the world. Twice a day, the tides pump water into the Wadden Sea, high tide, and out again, low tide. This provides nutrients in the form of algae and plankton to an enormous number of fish, mussels, worms, and snails, which in turn serve as food for larger animals in the food chain, such as birds. For example, there can be up to 60,000 snails per square meter. As a result, the Wadden Sea functions every spring and autumn as a gigantic feeding ground for 10 to 12 million migratory birds, including several endangered species that stop here on their long journeys, from south to north in spring and north to south in autumn. One of the greatest experiences of the Wadden Sea is the phenomenon known as Black Sun, when hundreds of thousands of starlings gather to roost for the night and perform a fascinating aerial ballet. The Wadden Sea Center, southwest of Ribe, and designed by Danish architect Dorothy Mandrup, tells the story of the Wadden Sea. Ribe. Ribe emerged as a market and trading place in the early 8th century and is therefore the oldest town in Denmark. Among the many traders from across Europe were missionaries who sought to convert the Danish population to Christianity. In 855, about 100 years before Harald Bluetooth, the first Danish king, was baptized as a Christian, the German missionary Ansgar built a church in Ribe. Today, the town has a particularly well-preserved medieval town center with cobblestone streets and half-timbered houses. Most central is Ribe Cathedral from the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, which contains very large, colorful, modern stained glass windows and frescoes depicting stories from the Bible. They were created by the Danish artist Carl Henning Pedersen between 1982 and 1987. Rolled Forest and Rebuild Hills. Rolled Forest is Denmark's second largest forest after Grib Forest in North Zealand. Originally, the forest consisted mainly of beech trees, but so many spruce and pine trees have been planted that it is now predominantly coniferous forest. Rebuild Hills is a landscape of heathland and stunted beech trees. Part of the area was purchased in 1912 by Danish Americans. Here you will find the festival grounds, where a Danish-American celebration of U.S. Independence Day is held every year on July 4th. At the Rebuild Museum, you can also learn more about the more than 300,000 Danes who emigrated to the United States, especially during the years 1868 to 1914. Rebuild Hills and Rolled Forest together form Northern Europe's largest area with natural water springs. Rainwater seeps down through the soil to the limestone bedrock below, where it is purified. At some point, it is pressed back up to the surface by the weight of the hills. The limestone in the subsoil acts like a sponge, storing the water so that it maintains a constant temperature of 7 to 8 degrees Celsius, regardless of the season. Among the many springs is Ravinkila, whose pure water tastes absolutely wonderful. Kronborg Castle. Denmark's history is closely shaped by the country's location at the entrance to the Baltic Sea. The shortest route into the Baltic Sea runs through the Øresund Strait. The town of Helsingør in North Zealand is located where the Øresund is at its narrowest point. For this reason, Helsingør has been crucial for controlling access to and from the Baltic Sea. From 1429 onward, ships sailing through the Øresund were required to stop and pay a tax, the so-called Øresund toll. This toll became one of the most important sources of income for the Danish king and the Danish state until it was abolished in 1857. To ensure payment of the toll, a fortress called Krogen was built, which at the end of the 16th century was expanded into Kronborg and rebuilt in the 17th century after a fire. In Kronborg's underground fortifications, known as the Casemates, sits a statue of the legendary hero Holger the Dane. A well-known myth says that if Denmark is threatened by external enemies, he will awaken to defend the country. For this reason, one of the most important resistance groups during the German occupation of Denmark from 1940 to 1945 took the name Holger Danske. Kronborg Castle is especially well known abroad because it forms the setting for the English playwright William Shakespeare's play, The Tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, from 1603, often simply called Hamlet. The play deals with revenge, doubt, and the relationship between life and death. It is frequently quoted for the famous line, "To be or not to be, that is the question." The line is spoken by the living Prince Hamlet, the symbol of to be, while he holds a skull in his hand, symbolizing death or not to be. Roskilde Cathedral. Roskilde Cathedral is regarded as Denmark's most important church. Construction began around 1200, and it is the first major brick building in Scandinavia. Like many other European cathedrals of the period, it was built in the so-called Gothic style, characterized by pointed, vertical arches that draw the eye upward toward the heavens. Since the early 15th century, Roskilde Cathedral has been the preferred burial church of the Danish royal family. Around 40 Danish kings and queens, more than anywhere else, are buried here. Several tombs are located in chapels that have been added to the church over time in the architectural styles of their respective periods. A visit to the cathedral is therefore also a journey through many centuries of architectural history. Queen Margrethe II's future tomb is located in one of the cathedral's side chapels, where she will one day be buried next to her many predecessors on the Danish throne. It will be in a sarcophagus designed by the artist Bjørn Nørgaard, who also created the tapestries for the Great Hall at Christiansborg Palace. Stevens, Clint. The cliff, up to 40 meters high, on eastern Zealand facing the Baltic Sea, has been formed over millions of years from ancient layers of light grey limestone, white chalk, and flint. In the middle of the cliff, A black line can be seen in the form of a 5 to 20 centimeter layer of fish clay that is about 65.5 million years old. More clearly than almost anywhere else in the world, this layer tells the story of one of the greatest natural catastrophes in Earth's history. The ash layer is the result of a meteor impact in Mexico that spread death and destruction across the entire globe. This event may also be the reason why the dinosaurs and about half of all animal species on Earth became extinct. Høyerup Church from the 13th century was built at a safe distance from the cliff. Nevertheless, part of the church collapsed into the sea in 1928 because wave erosion over time had worn away the cliff. Today, measures have been taken to protect the coastline and thus the church from further collapses. Møns Klint. Møns Klint is, as the name suggests, located on the island of Møn in the Baltic Sea. The high chalk cliffs are constantly changing because the sea gradually erodes the cliff face. Dronningestålen, the Queen's Chair, at 128 meters, is the highest point of the cliff. Geocenter Møns. Klint explains how the cliff was formed around 70 million years ago. At that time, algae with skeletons made of lime lived in the sea. When the algae died, the lime sank to the seabed, where a thick layer of chalk formed over millions of years. Later, the Earth's surface changed dramatically as land masses were uplifted. During the Ice Age, the ice sheets pushed the chalk together into a massive formation that became Møns Klint. Remains of some of the animals that lived in the sea 70 million years ago can today be found along the beach below the cliff in the form of fossils. These are especially sea urchins, but one can also find, for example, shark teeth and fossils of squid. To get from the top of the cliff down to the beach, visitors can use the Maglevan staircase, which, with its 497 steps, is the longest staircase in Denmark. H. C. Andersen's house. In 2021, an entirely new museum dedicated to the poet and his beloved fairy tales opened in Odense's H. C. Andersen Quarter. It was designed by the Japanese architect Kengo Kuma, and the ambition has been to give visitors a multifaceted artistic experience using sound, light, and images. Via a so-called biographical ramp, visitors descend underground, where the fairy tales can be experienced. The entrance to the museum is located right next to the small yellow house from 1799, where the poet was probably born in 1805. Hammershus. The castle of Hammershus was built in the 13th century by the Archbishop of Lund in Scania. Until the 16th century, the church owned large parts of Bornholm. Hammershus is located on a solitary cliff more than 70 meters above sea level and was therefore easy to defend. In 1743, Hammershus was abandoned, as the invention of cannons and other new weapons made the fortress less relevant. It was subsequently used as a quarry, meaning that local residents used its building stones to construct houses and other new buildings. Today, Hammershus is Northern Europe's largest castle ruin. Østerløs Church Bornholm is especially known for its 4 round churches. Østerløs Church, dating from around 1150, is the largest and possibly also the oldest. It naturally served as a church for the local population, but at the same time it was built as a refuge and defensive structure against enemies. Those defending the church were positioned on its upper floors. The narrow, circular staircases and corridors made it difficult for attackers to reach the top, at least more than one at a time. Copenhagen. The name Copenhagen originally means merchant's harbor. In the 11th century, the town was a fishing village called Hafen, harbor. In 1167, Bishop Absalon of Roskilde built a fortress on the site. The town continued to belong to the Bishop of Roskilde until 1416, when it was taken over by the king. Copenhagen's development into the country's largest city is largely due to its location by the Øresund Strait, and thus along the major international trade routes into and out of the Baltic Sea. In addition, the city lies in the shelter of the island of Amager, and therefore has a naturally protected harbour. The short distance, about 40 kilometers, to Kronborg in Helsingør further made Copenhagen an obvious stronghold from which the navy could support the guarding of ships sailing in and out through the strait. In the Middle Ages, approximately 1050 to 1500, the king spent most of his time traveling around the country with his officials and soldiers. However, during the 15th and 16th centuries, Copenhagen gradually became his permanent residence, and thus the undisputed capital of the realm. It was especially during the reign of Christian IV, 1588 to 1648, that Copenhagen developed into a major European city. Christian IV's buildings in Copenhagen. The construction-loving king left his mark on Copenhagen in the 17th century with a long series of prominent buildings. Perhaps the most famous and beloved of his buildings is the Round Tower, Rundetårn, from 1642. It is 41.55 meters high and is famous for its 200-meter-long spiral ramp leading up to the observation platform. Here, the letters RFP can be seen, an abbreviation of Christian IV's motto, the Latin Regna Firmat Pietas, piety strengthens the realms. At the beginning of the 17th century, Christian IV purchased several private plots outside Copenhagen's then city walls and created the King's Garden, Kongens Have. Since the 1770s, it has been open to the public, and today it is one of Copenhagen's most popular parks. In the garden, he built a small pleasure pavilion that was gradually expanded and completed in 1634 as Rosenborg Castle. The crown jewels are kept in the treasury at Rosenborg and primarily consist of 4 large sets of jewelry. The Queen normally wears them at the New Year's court and during state visits and other major events. The treasury also displays the so-called regalia, especially the orb and the scepter, which symbolize the power and dignity of the king or queen. The king wished to make Copenhagen a European center of trade, and therefore he built the stock exchange, Børsen, which was completed in 1640. The stock exchange's hallmark is the dragon spire, with 4 dragon tails twisted around each other. It is said to protect the building from enemy attacks and fire. However, it did not protect it any better than that half of the building, including the dragon spire, was destroyed by a major fire in April 2024. The unique district of Nyboder is also due to Christian IV. In 1631, he decided that good housing should be built for the Navy's soldiers, and the neighborhood consists of 200 terraced houses, each about 40 square meters. In the 18th century, Nyboder had 6,000 inhabitants. Today, just over 2,000 people with ties to the Danish armed forces live there. Amalienborg Palace. Amalienborg is the main residence of the royal family. The palace is named after Queen Sophie Amalie, 1628 to 1685, who was married to Frederick III. The queen had a palace built and named it after herself, Sophie Amalienborg. This palace burned down in 1689. The current complex on the site, where the name has been shortened to Amalienborg, consists of 4 almost identical palaces which were built by wealthy noble families in the 18th century. In fact, it was not originally intended that the royal family should live at Amalienborg. However, when Christiansborg Palace burned for the first time in 1794, the royal family was left without a residence and therefore purchased Amalienborg. From the reception room in one of the palaces, the king delivers his New Year's address every year on New Year's Eve at 6 p.m. On special occasions in the royal family, it is tradition for the king and his family to appear on the palace balcony to receive public acclaim. The royal lifeguards, wearing their large bearskin hats, change guard at Amalienborg every day at 12 noon. On special occasions, such as the king's birthday, the guards wear red uniforms. Otherwise, they are dressed in blue. Tivoli. When Tivoli opened in 1843, few people would have believed that an amusement park had been created that would become known in large parts of the world. Denmark's most visited tourist attraction is famous for its exotic architecture and historic buildings. In addition, it features beautiful gardens and rides, such as the old wooden roller coaster from 1914. In the evening, thousands of colored lights create a fairy tale atmosphere. Finally, there is the Pantomime Theatre, where the oldest of the theatre's pantomime performances are more than 200 years old. The Little Mermaid. The inspiration for The Little Mermaid came from H.C. Andersen's fairy tale of the same name from 1837. It tells the story of a mermaid who falls in love with the prince she cannot have. This sculpture from 1913, which sits on a rock in Copenhagen harbor, is only 125 centimeters tall, but it is one of Denmark's most famous and visited tourist attractions. The Little Mermaid has been vandalized several times, for example, by having political messages painted on it, or by having its head or arms sawed off. New architecture in Copenhagen. Copenhagen has developed enormously in recent decades, with a number of exciting buildings created by Danish architects. One example is the Opera House by Henning Larsen from 2005, with a total floor area of 41,000 square meters spread over 14 floors. The three large light sculptures in the foyer are by Olafur Eliasson, while the four bronze reliefs were made by Per Kirkeby. The Black Diamond, the library, from 1999 was designed by Schmidt Hammer Lassen and features a large ceiling decoration by Per Kirkeby. The UN City at Marmormolen, designed by the architectural firm 3XN, is shaped like an 8-pointed star. It houses 11 UN organizations with 1,500 employees from more than 100 countries. The spectacular residential complex 8 Talet in Ørestad on Amager was designed by Bjarke Ingels Group, BUG, and was named the world's best residential building in 2011. 6.3. The Danish flag. The Danish national flag, the Dannebrog, consists of a white cross on a red background. Dannebrog means the banner of the Danes, or red-colored banner. Although legend tells that the Dannebrog fell from the sky during a military battle in Estonia in 1219 and secured victory for the Danes, the flag was, in reality, most likely a banner already used by knights who went on crusades during the Middle Ages. The Dannebrog is regarded as one of the oldest national flags in the world and has been used since the 15th century as a banner when Danish kings went to war. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, only the authorities and the navy used the Danish national flag. From the mid-19th century, however, it became popular among the general population to fly the flag. Today, many Danes fly the Dannebrog on festive occasions, such as private birthdays or official commemorative days. The flag is also used at funerals and memorial services, where it is flown at half-mast until the service has taken place. On certain dates, all public authorities are required to fly the flag. This applies, for example, on religious holidays and on the birthdays of members of the royal family. Many companies and private individuals also mark these days by hoisting the Dannebrog. Historical anniversaries are likewise observed by flying the flag, such as Denmark's liberation on May 5th and Constitution Day on June 5th. In Denmark, it is not permitted to fly the flags of other countries without permission from the police. However, it is allowed to fly the flag of Greenland, the flag of the Faroe Islands, the flags of the other Nordic countries, as well as the UN flag and the EU flag, without police permission. Denmark's most well-known order, medal, the Order of the Dannebrog, is named after the Danish flag. It is awarded by the king to senior civil servants, politicians, cultural figures, members of the military, prominent business leaders, and researchers who have made a special contribution to promoting Denmark's interests. 6.4. The Royal House. The Danish Royal House is among the oldest of the world's 43 monarchies. It is more than 1,000 years old and can be traced with certainty back to Gorm the Old in the 10th century. Since then, Denmark has had a total of 54 monarchs, 52 kings, and 2 queens. From 1448 to 1863, Denmark was ruled by the House of Oldenburg, and thereafter by the House of Glücksburg, which shares the same ancestors as the Oldenburg dynasty. Denmark's current monarch is King Frederik X, born 1968, who belongs to this dynasty. He succeeded his mother, Queen Margrethe II, who chose to abdicate on January 14, 2024, the same date in 1972, on which she herself ascended the throne following the death of her father, Frederik IX. Since 1448, when the House of Oldenburg took the throne, 20 out of 21 Danish kings have incidentally been named either Christian or Frederick. Denmark is a constitutional monarchy. This means that the monarchy operates within the framework of the constitution and democracy. The monarch, the king or queen, is not politically elected but inherits the throne. The king has no real political power. He does not intervene in political life, does not express political opinions, and cannot be held accountable for the conduct of government. However, a number of the king's formal duties are linked to political life. Among other things, he attends the opening of the Danish Parliament, the Folketing, on the first Tuesday of October, and takes part in the appointment of ministers and the formation of a new government. The king signs the laws passed by the Folketing and the government together with the politically responsible minister. This takes place at the Council of State at Christiansborg, where the king meets with the government's ministers. The king is also the host when Denmark receives state visits and represents the country on state visits abroad. In addition, he carries out a wide range of other formal and representative duties in Denmark. The king and the royal family are a national focal point. The royal house holds a central place in Danish history and is very popular among the population. Many people, for example, watch on television when the monarch delivers the traditional New Year's speech on New Year's Eve from the royal family's home at Amalienborg in Copenhagen or from the residence at Fredensborg Palace. Many also gather at Amalienborg Palace Square to celebrate the king on his birthday, which is on May 26th. Since 2004, the king has been married to Queen Mary, born 1972, who originally comes from Australia. Together they have 4 children: Crown Prince Christian, born 2005, Princess Isabella, born 2007, and the twins, Prince Vincent and Princess Josephine, born 2011. The eldest, Crown Prince Christian, will one day ascend the throne as King Christian XI. 6.5. Immigration to Denmark. Through the ages. The Danish population is relatively homogeneous, meaning that most people share the same language, culture, and history. Nevertheless, people from other countries have settled permanently in Denmark throughout history. They have arrived, among other reasons, as refugees, for work, or because they married a Dane. This represents many hundreds of years of immigration, which has left a certain mark on the Danish population, the Danish language, and Danish culture. Immigration to Denmark has, however, been by far the greatest in more recent times. Especially over the past few decades, the number of immigrants and descendants of immigrants in Denmark has increased significantly, from around 150,000 in 1980 to 977,000 in 2025, corresponding to 16.3% of Denmark's total population of nearly 6 million. The Jews are an example of a minority that has lived in Denmark for a long time. The first Jews arrived in Denmark in the 17th century at the invitation of the king. They received a mixed reception and lived under difficult conditions, and to obtain residence permits, they had to pay large sums of money and submit to stricter legislation than the rest of the population. At the end of the 18th century, about 1,600 Jews lived in Copenhagen. Gradually, Jews were granted more rights, and with the so-called Jewish Letter of Freedom in 1814, Jews were almost placed on equal footing with other Danes. In the early 20th century, a further approximately 3,000 Jews arrived in Denmark, fleeing poverty and persecution in Russia. Over time, Jews became an accepted and well-integrated part of Danish society. Partly for this reason, the vast majority of Danish Jews were helped to escape to Sweden by fellow Danes in 1943 during Nazi Germany's occupation of Denmark. In this way, they avoided the widespread genocide that Jews suffered in other German-controlled areas during the war. Around the time of the Second World War, it was primarily war refugees who came to Denmark. The largest group consisted of nearly 240,000 war refugees from Germany who arrived at the end of or immediately after the occupation period, 1945. In addition, about 23,000 war refugees arrived mainly from the Soviet Union and the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. By the late 1940s, however, the vast majority of these refugees had returned to their home countries. In the first decades after the Second World War, refugees from Eastern European countries were the main group arriving in Denmark. These included Hungarian refugees following the uprising in Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakians who fled during the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Polish Jews who were forced to leave Poland due to an anti-Semitic wave in the country in 1968 to 1969. Immigration in the 1960s was, however, particularly characterized by guest workers from especially Turkey, Pakistan, and the former Yugoslavia. They fulfilled a significant need for foreign labor in the Danish labor market. A large proportion settled permanently in Denmark and later brought their families to the country. This was still possible despite the immigration stop that was introduced in 1973. During the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, refugees once again arrived in Denmark. These were mainly refugees from the war between Iraq and Iran, 1980 to 88, and the civil war in Yugoslavia, 1991 to 95. In addition, refugees also arrived from, among other places, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Somalia, as well as Palestinian refugees, particularly those fleeing the civil war in Lebanon. Between 2000 and 2020, people primarily arrived from Afghanistan, the Middle East, and Africa, fleeing war and poverty. The number of asylum seekers coming to Europe and Denmark peaked during the so-called refugee crisis, when a total of 21,000 people sought asylum in Denmark in 2015. The largest group had fled the civil war in Syria. During the same period, many more foreign nationals also came to Denmark to work. They arrived from all over the world, but the majority came from other EU countries. the number of immigrants and descendants from other EU countries increased from 116,000 in 2000 to 312,000 in 2025. EU citizens have the right to work freely in other EU countries, and most of this increase can be attributed to the EU enlargements in 2004, 2007, and 2013, which added a total of 11 Eastern European countries. These enlargements led many Eastern Europeans to move to Western Europe, including Denmark, where wages are generally higher and living conditions better. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, a large number of Ukrainians have arrived in Denmark. As of January 1st, 2025, 35,000 displaced persons from Ukraine were living in Denmark. As of January 2025, the 10 countries of origin with the largest numbers of immigrants and descendants in Denmark are Turkey, 68,000, Poland, 57,000, Ukraine, 50,000, Romania, 46,000, Syria, 46,000, Germany, 43,000, Iraq, 35,000, Lebanon, 28,000, Iran, 28,000, and Pakistan, 28,000. 6.6. The realm community between Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. Denmark is in a realm community with Greenland and the Faroe Islands. The official name of this realm community is the Kingdom of Denmark. The constitution applies to all three parts of the realm, which share the king as head of state. The Faroe Islands and Greenland each elect 2 members to the Danish parliament, the Folketing. Greenland and the Faroe Islands pass their own laws in a wide range of areas and have their own administrations. In other areas, the Folketing also passes laws for Greenland and the Faroe Islands, and administration is handled by Danish authorities. This applies, among other things, to foreign and security policy, as well as currency and monetary policy. In 2005, Greenland and the Faroe Islands were given the opportunity, either individually or jointly, to negotiate and conclude certain international agreements on behalf of the realm. Greenland's geography. With an area of 2.1 million square kilometers, Greenland is the world's largest island. It is approximately the same size as Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, and Greece combined. Geographically, Greenland is part of the North American continent and lies far to the north, northeast of Canada. Greenland accounts for 98% of the total area of the realm community, Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. About 83% of Greenland is covered by ice year-round. The largest continuous ice-covered area is called the inland ice, the Greenland ice sheet. It covers 1.7 million square kilometers, about 80% of Greenland's total area, and is up to 3,400 meters thick. Greenland's highest point is Gunnbjørn Fjeld, located in eastern Greenland at 3,694 meters above sea level. Gunnbjørn Fjeld is also the highest point in the world north of the Arctic Circle. The approximately 57,000 inhabitants live along the coast. Around 20,000 people live in the capital, Nuuk, formerly Gottorp, which is Greenland's largest city. Greenland's history. Greenland has been inhabited for thousands of years. From around 2,500 BC, small groups of Arctic hunting peoples immigrated in several waves from Canada. Greenland's northern, western, and eastern coasts were settled, and different hunting cultures developed. Finds such as animal bones show that northern cultures depended on musk ox hunting, while southern cultures lived mainly from seal hunting and reindeer hunting. The modern Greenlandic people, the Inuit, migrated from Alaska and Canada to northwestern Greenland around AD 1200 and later spread to southern Greenland. Archaeological finds show that Icelanders and Norwegians settled in Greenland as early as the 10th century AD. These so-called Norse settlers pledged allegiance to the Norwegian king in the 13th century and thereby became part of the Danish-Norwegian Union from 1380. They remained in Greenland until the 15th century. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Danish king sent several expeditions to Greenland, but a permanent Danish presence was not established until the 18th century. In 1721, the priest Hans Egede traveled to the island to trade and to Christianize the Greenlandic population, and in 1728 he founded the colony of Gudtorp, which today is Greenland's capital, in Greenlandic, Nuuk. During the Second World War, Greenland, unlike Denmark, was not occupied by the Germans. Contrary to the wishes of the German occupying power, and thus also of the Danish government, Denmark's ambassador in Washington, D.C., Henrik Kaufmann, concluded an agreement with the United States in 1941 that allowed the Americans to establish military bases in Greenland. This was necessary, among other reasons, to protect and supply Greenland's inhabitants with food, building materials, medicine, and fuel, which had previously come from Denmark. The Americans, for their part, wanted to prevent other countries, especially Germany, from occupying Greenland, and the United States also needed minerals from Greenland's subsoil for its war production. After the Second World War, the United States continued to maintain military bases in Greenland by agreement with Denmark. In the early 1950s, the Americans built a base in Qaanaaq, Thule, in northern Greenland, which involved relocating settlements of several Greenlandic families to make room for the base. The base is the northernmost U.S. military base and was strategically important due to its short distance to the Soviet Union, making it central to the air defense of the United States and NATO. The base was previously known as Thule Air Base, Thulebasen. In 2023, it was renamed Pituffik Space Base and is still used by the United States. Greenland's self-government. Until 1953, Greenland was a colony under Denmark. With the Constitutional Amendment of 1953, Greenland became subject to the Constitution on equal terms with Denmark and the Faroe Islands. In 1978, Greenland and Denmark agreed to establish home rule for Greenland. Following a referendum, Greenland was granted home rule by law in 1979. This meant that Greenland gradually assumed responsibility for, and the right to pass its own laws in, a number of areas in the following years, such as social policy, taxes and duties, and education. In 2009, the home rule arrangement was replaced by a self-government system, which gave Greenland authority over even more areas. These include the judicial system and the management of resources and raw materials in the subsoil. It was also established that the Greenlandic people are a people in their own right, with the right to full independence when they so wish. Greenland's National Day is June 21st, as it is the longest and brightest day of the year. The self-government system therefore came into force on June 21st, 2009, and the Greenlandic flag was first raised on June 21st, 1985. In Greenlandic, the flag is called Erfalasorput, meaning our flag. The colors of the flag are red and white, like the Danish flag. The circle in the flag symbolizes the rising sun in the white Greenlandic landscape. The flag is widely used in Greenland. The self-government consists of Greenland's parliament, Inatsisartut, which is an elected legislative assembly, and an administration led by the government of Greenland, Naalakkersuisut. The government functions like a cabinet and holds executive political power. The parliament has 31 members elected for 4-year terms. The head of government, the premier, is elected by the parliament. The parliament passes laws in all areas that have been taken over by self-government. These include, among others, social services, education, healthcare, taxes and duties, housing, commercial fishing and hunting, raw materials, municipal affairs, the environment, culture and leisure, and infrastructure. Economy and society. In 2025, Greenland receives an annual financial grant from the Danish state of just over 4 billion Danish kroner, covering slightly more than half of the self-government's expenditures. Fishing, especially shrimp fishing, is the most important source of export income for Greenlandic society. With the self-government arrangement from 2009, it was established that revenues from raw material activities in Greenland accrue to the Greenlandic self-government. At the same time, it was decided that such revenues would lead to a reduction in the Danish state's grant to Greenland. The main industries in Greenland are fishing and tourism. The traditional hunting livelihood, in which people lived primarily from hunting seals, is declining. Greenland became a member of the European Economic Community, now the EU, as part of the Kingdom of Denmark in 1973, but following a referendum in Greenland, it withdrew again in 1985. Greenland's cultural life. Greenland has a rich cultural life that ranges from traditional drum dancing to modern rock music. The ancient Greenlandic legends have been written down and are taught in schools. In addition, there is a widespread production of handicrafts carved from bones and teeth of animals found in and around Greenland. Hans Linge, 1906 to 1988, is regarded as one of the most significant figures in Greenlandic visual art and literature. He was also politically active, a critic of Denmark's influence on Greenland, and an advocate of greater Greenlandic independence. His art is characterized by a strong love for the original Greenlandic cultural heritage and the Inuit people's traditional way of life. He is especially known for the novel Ersin Gitsup Piu Masa, The Will of the Invisible, from 1938, which deals with revenge and the conflict between traditional notions of honor and modern conscience. In 2021, the Greenlandic author Niviaq Corneliussen, born 1990, received the Nordic Council Literature Prize for the novel Naasuliadapi, Flower Valley, from 2020. The book addresses social and psychological problems among young Greenlanders and their feeling of belonging neither to traditional Greenlandic culture nor to a modern metropolis such as Copenhagen. It also portrays the lack of ability and willingness among politicians, authorities, families, and friends to help them. Christianity plays a significant role in Greenland. The Church of Greenland is part of the Danish National Church, but falls under Greenland's self-government. Greenland has its own bishop. Church services are conducted in Greenlandic, and a distinctive Greenlandic tradition has developed in the way hymns are sung in churches. The geography of the Faroe Islands. The Faroe Islands are an archipelago consisting of 18 islands located in the Atlantic Ocean between Scotland, Iceland, and Norway. The island's total area of 1,400 square kilometers is roughly equivalent to that of the island of Lolland. The Faroe Islands have a population of 54,000. About 14,000 of them live in the capital, Tórshavn, which is also the largest city. The landscape is characterized by steep, grass-covered cliffs. The highest point, Slættaratindur, rises 880 meters above sea level. The Faroe Islands have a climate with mild winters and cool summers, as well as large amounts of rainfall. Despite the northern location, winters in Tórshavn are slightly warmer than in Denmark. During the rest of the year, however, temperatures are somewhat cooler than in Denmark. The weather often changes quickly, and despite the country's small size, there can be considerable differences in weather from island to island. The history of the Faroe Islands. The Faroe Islands were first settled in the 7th century by Irish monks who established themselves on the islands. However, the monks were quickly displaced by Vikings, mainly from Norway, who carried out extensive settlement of the Faroe Islands. As a result, the islands became part of the North Atlantic cultural and trading community. During the Middle Ages, the Faroe Islands came under the Norwegian king and thus followed Norway into the union with Denmark in 1380. In 1816, the Faroe Islands became a Danish county, and in 1849, they came under the Danish constitution. When Denmark was occupied by Germany in 1940, the Faroe Islands were occupied by Great Britain. The islands had great strategic importance for transport routes between the United States and Europe, and the British therefore wanted to prevent Germany from occupying them. Britain did not otherwise interfere much in Faroes politics, which made it possible for the Faroes to govern themselves to a greater extent than they had been accustomed to under Denmark. When Great Britain returned the Faroe Islands to Denmark after the war in 1945, the desire for independence on the islands had grown considerably. After the Second World War, negotiations began on a home rule arrangement for the Faroe Islands. A referendum showed a very small majority in favor of independence from Denmark. However, most politicians in the Faroes Parliament, the Lagting, as well as the Danish government, did not regard the result as clear. After a new election to the Lagting, Denmark and the Faroe Islands agreed on home rule, and the Faroe Islands therefore remained in the realm community with Denmark. Home rule was granted by law in 1948. The home rule system consists of the Lagting, an elected legislative assembly, and an administration led by a government, the executive political leadership. The Lagting can have up to 33 members elected for 4-year terms. The head of government, the Løgmaður, is elected by the Lagting. The Lagting passes laws in all areas that have been taken over by home rule. These include, among others, social services, education, taxation, housing, fisheries, subsoil resources, municipal affairs, culture and leisure, and infrastructure. In 2005, the Faroes home rule arrangement was expanded. Today, the Faroe Islands can take over all areas except the Constitution, citizenship, the Supreme Court, foreign, defense, and security policy, as well as currency and monetary policy. In 2025, the Faroe Islands receive an annual financial grant from the Danish state of approximately 575 million Danish kroner. Fishing is by far the most important source of export income for Faroes society, but shipping and tourism also play a major role in the economy. When Denmark became a member of the EEC, now the EU, in 1973, the Faroe Islands chose to remain outside. This also means that the Faroe Islands can conclude their own trade agreements independently of the EU. Christianity generally plays a greater role in Faroes society than in Denmark. Many Faroes still attend church on Sundays. The Danish law permitting free abortion up to the 18th week of pregnancy does not apply in the Faroe Islands. Here, abortion is permitted only if the woman has been raped or if the pregnancy threatens her life or health. There is, however, disagreement on this issue among the island's population, and there has been ongoing debate about whether women should have easier access to abortion. In the spring of 2024, the Lagting voted on introducing free abortion. 15 members voted in favor and 15 against, meaning there was just barely a majority for it. Faroese cultural life. The Faroe Islands have a rich cultural life. Authors such as the two cousins Jørgen Franz Jacobsen, 1900 to 1938, and William Heinesen, 1900 to 1991, are well known both in the Faroe Islands, in Denmark, and in several other countries. Jørgen Franz Jacobsen's main work is Barbara, published in 1939, the year after his death. The novel is set in the 18th century in the Faroe Islands. Barbara is a young woman who easily falls in love and has great attraction for men. Everyone in the small religious local community has an opinion about Barbara. It is said, among other things, that her sin is responsible for the deaths of her two previous husbands, both former priests, and for her having seduced the new priest. Like the Faroe Islands' wild nature and harsh, changeable weather, Barbara's nature cannot be tamed and has a strong impact on the local community. The theme of social deviation, that is, when people's way of life does not fit into a small community with narrow boundaries between right and wrong, also appears in William Heinesen's main work, The Lost Musicians, De Fortabte Spillemænd, 1950. At the center of the story is a group of musicians who live a life filled with music, alcohol, and women. The hard-working, frugal, and religious local population finds it difficult to accept this dissolute lifestyle, and as a result, the musicians are unable to settle down and achieve stability in life. Faroese painting is also of a very high standard. Faroese painters often depict Faroes motifs such as the wild nature and life in small villages, but in a style and with a choice of colors that elevate the Faroese experience into something universally recognizable. The Faroe Islands flag is called Mørkid, the banner. It was designed in 1919 and is a Nordic-style flag with a cross, using the colors white, blue, and red. When Denmark was occupied by Germany in 1940 and the Faroe Islands by Great Britain, the British demanded that it be possible to distinguish between Danish and Faroe ships, which until then had also used the Danish flag. Therefore, Great Britain approved Mørkid as the flag of the Faroe Islands on April 25, 1940. Every year on April 25th, Faroes people gather for public celebrations to mark their flag. Typically, a flag speech is held and communal singing takes place. The flag is also seen in every town in the Faroe Islands on July 29th, which is the Faroes' National Day. On this day, Olafsuka, St. Olaf's festival, is celebrated, named after Olaf the Holy, who was king of Norway and died in battle on July 29th, 1030. Most Faroes people at that time were descendants of Norwegian settlers, and therefore Olaf the Holy became the patron saint of the Faroe Islands, that is, the saint believed to protect the islands. 6.7 Denmark and the Nordic countries. Many Danes feel that they have particularly strong ties to their Nordic neighbors. This is due to significant historical, cultural, political, and linguistic commonalities among the countries. For this reason, people often speak of a kind of family consisting of the 5 Nordic countries: Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Iceland. A very visible symbol of this community is that all 5 countries, using different color combinations, share the same cross in their flags. Geography and population. The 4 other Nordic countries have a somewhat different geography from Denmark, which consists of a small and relatively densely populated area. Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Iceland are all much larger in size, but in return, they are among the 4 most sparsely populated countries in Europe. These countries generally have a colder climate than Denmark, and much larger areas of wild nature, and in several places, especially in Norway, also mountain landscapes. With 10.7 million inhabitants, Sweden has the largest population in the Nordic region. Iceland, with fewer than 400,000 inhabitants, has by far the smallest population, only slightly larger than that of the city of Aarhus. Both Finland and Norway, each with about 5.6 million inhabitants, have populations close to Denmark's nearly 6 million. History: dividing and uniting. The histories of the Nordic countries are to a large extent intertwined. However, the relationship has not always been harmonious. The Kalmar Union, 1397 to 1523, the only period in which the entire Nordic region was politically united, ended when Sweden broke away after decades of hard struggle. This was followed by a period, 1563 to 1721, marked by many major wars between Denmark-Norway on one side and Sweden on the other, over dominance in the Nordic region and the Baltic Sea. In Denmark, these wars are often referred to as the Swedish Wars. There are also chapters of history that the Nordic peoples look back on together with a sense of nostalgia. The Viking Age and ancient Nordic mythology, Norse paganism, form an important shared feature in the histories of Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. At that time, a common language, Old Norse, was spoken, from which modern Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, and Icelandic have developed. These four languages are therefore closely related. Since the Middle Ages, Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian, unlike Icelandic, have adopted many words from other languages, especially German. The three languages have preserved and further developed so many common features that Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians can relatively easily read and understand one another's languages. The majority of the Finnish population has completely different roots from the populations of the other Nordic countries, and the Finnish language is therefore very different. However, in Finland, both Finnish and Swedish are official languages, and almost all students learn both languages in school. This is because Finland was governed from Sweden from the 13th century until 1809, and has therefore long been strongly influenced by Swedish language and culture, and also has a Swedish-speaking minority. In Iceland too, due to the country's long association with Denmark, 1380 to 1944, it is common to learn Danish in school as a foreign language. In this way, a certain linguistic connection among all five countries has been preserved. All the Nordic countries became Christian and adhered to the Catholic faith during the Viking Age and the Middle Ages. During the Reformation in the 16th century, the Nordic churches broke with Catholicism and the Pope, and instead became Protestant, Evangelical Lutheran. This has remained the dominant denomination in the Nordic region to this day. The Nordic countries after 1945. Since the Second World War, the Nordic countries have particularly distinguished themselves by succeeding in becoming some of the richest countries in the world, while at the same time being among those with the greatest economic equality. This is often referred to as the Nordic welfare model. It is characterized, among other things, by the state providing a wide range of welfare services, for example, education, healthcare, and elderly care, to all citizens, and by this welfare being collectively financed by the entire population through taxes and duties. The country's foreign policies have shown both differences and similarities. Their relationships with the EU and NATO have differed. Norway and Iceland remain outside the EU, while Finland and Sweden became members of NATO in 2023 and 2024, respectively. On the other hand, all the Nordic countries are known for prioritizing the United Nations and international peace efforts highly, and are also among the countries in the world that provide the most development aid to poorer regions. In addition, there is an official Nordic cooperation aimed at strengthening political, economic, and cultural ties in the Nordic region. For example, in areas such as the environment, culture, and research. Cooperation takes place in the Nordic Council, which consists of politicians from the national parliaments, and in the Nordic Council of Ministers, which consists of ministers from the country's governments. Members include Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and Finland, as well as the self-governing territories of Greenland and the Faroe Islands under Denmark, and the Åland Islands under Finland. 6.8 Danish Science and Thinking. Research and innovation are today among the fundamental pillars of the Danish economy and thus of Danish welfare. Danish research largely takes place at universities, but research is also carried out at, for example, university hospitals, museums, libraries, and archives. In addition, a great deal of research takes place in the private business sector. Denmark is internationally known for its research, especially within medicine, biochemistry, and technology. Danish research at an international level has roots far back in history. Over time, several Danish scientists have helped shape international scientific development. One of the earliest Danish scientists was the astronomer Tycho Brahe, 1546 to 1601, a nobleman from Scania who came to Copenhagen in 1559 to study at the university. He was a mathematical prodigy, constructed astronomical instruments, and carried out the most precise mapping of the night sky to date. One of Tycho Brahe's great achievements was the discovery of a new star, Nova Stella, in the constellation Cassiopeia. His observations were especially significant because the world-famous German astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630, used them to formulate his groundbreaking laws describing how the planets move around the sun. Niels Steensen, 1638 to 1686, also contributed to science in the 17th century. Like Tycho Brahe, he did not accept established explanations, but emphasized his own observations. Niels Steensen was trained as a physician and traveled to the Netherlands, where he made important discoveries in anatomy, that is, the structure of the human body. Among other things, he was the first to show how we cry, and he demonstrated that the heart is a muscle and not, as was often previously believed, the seat of the soul and emotions. The astronomer and physicist Ole Rømer, 1644 to 1710, made an important scientific discovery in 1676 when he found that light has a delay, meaning that it does not propagate instantaneously but travels at a certain speed from source to observer. He later described new methods for measuring weight and distance. He also laid the groundwork for introducing the current Gregorian calendar in Denmark in the year 1700. Until the early 18th century, it was not known whether Asia and North America were connected by land. To explore this question, the Russian Tsar, Peter the Great, sent out an expedition in 1725, led by the Danish naval officer and explorer Vitus Bering, 1681 to 1741. In 1728, Bering's expedition succeeded in sailing through the strait separating Siberia and Alaska, thereby proving that Asia and North America are separated by water. A few years later, Bering returned as leader of a new and even larger expedition to map the coast of Alaska. On the return journey, the expedition was shipwrecked on a small deserted island off Russia's east coast, where it was forced to spend the winter in extreme cold and without wood for heating. Many died, including Vitus Bering himself. He is buried on the island that today bears his name, Bering Island, just as the surrounding sea is called the Bering Sea and the strait separating Siberia and Alaska is called the Bering Strait. In 1820, the physicist H. C. Ørsted, 1777 to 1851, discovered that electric current produces magnetism, known as electromagnetism. A connection between electricity and magnetism had already been described by the Italian philosopher Romagnosi in 1802, but Oerstede's work was more thorough and gained widespread recognition in scientific circles. The discovery of electromagnetism laid the foundation for the technological use of electricity in society and industry. Ørsted also aimed to make natural science accessible and understandable to a broader segment of the population. Among other things, he worked to give scientific concepts Danish terms. For example, he coined the Danish words ilt and brint instead of the foreign words oxygen and hydrogen. Denmark has also made an international mark in philosophy, primarily due to Søren Kierkegaard, 1813 to 1855. During his 42 years of life, he wrote a number of influential works in philosophy, theology, psychology, and literature. Either/or from 1843 is one of his most important works. Søren Kierkegaard is regarded as the founder of existentialist philosophy, which holds that each individual becomes who they are through the choices they make. In the mid-19th century, ideas about women's emancipation and gender equality were formulated by the author Mathilde Fibiger, 1830 to 1872, who published the epistolary novel Clara Raphael, 12 Letters, in 1851. The book sparked an extensive debate among authors, artists, and politicians about women's role in society, and she inspired the organized women's movement that emerged from the 1870s onward. Contrary to the ideals of marriage at the time, Mathilde Fibiger never married, but was employed as a telegraph operator at the Danish State Telegraph, becoming Denmark's first female civil servant. Danish science in modern times. The Danish Greenlandic polar researcher Knud Rasmussen, 1879 to 1933, played a major role in the exploration of Greenland and other Arctic regions. On his 7 expeditions, known as the Thule expeditions, 1912 to 1933, he mapped geography, collected thousands of objects such as hunting tools, jewelry, and furs, and gathered extensive knowledge about the Inuit, a group of Arctic peoples. Of particular importance was his 5th and largest expedition, 1921 to 1924, during which he traveled 18,000 kilometers by dog sled from Greenland through northern Canada and Alaska and across the frozen Bering Strait to eastern Siberia. On this long journey, he explored several Inuit settlements and demonstrated that, across vast distances, there exists a shared culture, mythology, and traditions among different Inuit groups. In the 20th century, the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, 1885 to 1962, achieved international fame. As a young man, he proposed a model of atomic structure for which he received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1922. His most important scientific contributions, however, were within quantum mechanics, where he worked together with other leading international researchers. Niels Bohr also took an active part in the political debate about nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, which his research had helped make possible. The seismologist and geophysicist Inge Lehmann, 1888 to 1993, demonstrated in a 1936 article through observations of earthquakes in New Zealand that the Earth has an inner core. She achieved success as a researcher in the United States, and her studies were used by the American military during the Cold War to calculate the explosive power of test detonations of Soviet nuclear bombs. In 1997, the Danish physician and scientist Jens Christian Skue, 1918 to 2018, received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his discovery of the so-called sodium-potassium pump, which transports the chemical elements sodium and potassium out of and into the body's cells, respectively. Malfunctions in the sodium-potassium pump lead to heart and nervous system diseases. Jens Christian Skue was a professor at Aarhus University, and it took 40 years from the time he published his first article about the discovery until he received the Nobel Prize. Within physics, Lene Vestergaard Hau, born 1959, has gained international recognition. She became widely known in 1999 when she slowed down the speed of light, and in 2001 she succeeded in stopping a light pulse completely. Lene Vestergaard Hau is a professor at Harvard University in the United States. Morten Meldal, born 1954, a professor at the University of Copenhagen, received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2022, together with two American researchers, for laying the foundation for so-called click chemistry. With click chemistry, new molecules can be created using fewer building blocks and fewer chemical reactions than natural processes require. Click chemistry is also known as molecular Lego, as it can connect molecules without the molecules interfering with one another. This makes it possible, for example, to test and produce new medicines more quickly. 6.9. Church and religion in Denmark. There is freedom of religion in Denmark. This ensures that citizens have the right to form religious communities in order to practice their faith in the way they choose. Freedom of religion was written into the Constitution in 1849 as one of the fundamental civil liberties of the new democracy. Freedom of religion means that each individual citizen may practice the religion he or she wishes. Everyone is also free to change religion, and one may choose not to be religious at all. All citizens in Denmark have the same civil and political rights, regardless of whether they have one religion, another religion, or no religious belief. Denmark's monarch, the king, is the only person not covered by freedom of religion. The Constitution states that the monarch must belong to the Evangelical Lutheran Protestant Church. The Evangelical Lutheran Church is the Danish national church, the folk church, and is supported by the state. This is established in the Constitution. The state provides financial support to the folk church. Members of the folk church pay a special church tax, which functions as a membership fee. Only members of the folk church are therefore required to pay church tax. The Danish national church and Christianity have left many traces in Danish society. Churches can be found throughout the country as visible symbols of Christianity's long history in Denmark. Christianity has helped shape the development of Danish society. Church festivals and public holidays are still observed throughout the year. In addition, the Danish National Church carries out a number of tasks on behalf of the state, such as registering births, name changes, and deaths. The Church has performed these tasks for several hundred years. One of the defining characteristics of the Danish National Church is that no one can speak on behalf of the Church as a whole. The folk church has no official spokesperson, nor does it participate as a church in political debate. Most Danes regard religion as a private matter, and there is a tradition of separating religion and politics. The Danish National Church is often described as a broad and inclusive church, meaning that it allows considerable differences in how evangelical Lutheran Christianity is understood. The majority of the Danish population, about 71% in 2025, are members of the folk church. However, there are large geographical differences. In the municipality of Copenhagen, 46% of the population are members, while in sparsely populated areas, the proportion is typically much higher. For example, 83% in Jammerbugt municipality in North Jutland. Membership is voluntary, and members are free to leave the folk church if they wish. How often members attend church services or other church events varies greatly. The organization of the folk church, like that of other public institutions, is democratic and based on the participation of its members. Traditionally, the term parish, sogn, is used for the geographical area in which the local church's members live. A parish is led by a parish council, menighetsråd, consisting of the parish priests and members who are democratically elected by the congregation. The highest administrative authority of the folk church is the Minister for Ecclesiastical Affairs. Long before freedom of religion was introduced, the king had granted special permission for Jews as well as Roman Catholic and Reformed Christians to practice their faith in Denmark. Since the Constitution was introduced, citizens have made use of freedom of religion to form many different congregations or religious communities. Some, like the folk church, are based on the evangelical Lutheran understanding of Christianity, but wish to remain independent of the folk church. Others are based on one of the many other Christian traditions found around the world. In addition, Denmark has congregations and religious communities representing most of the other major world religions. A group of citizens may freely form a congregation or religious community. It does not need to be registered with or approved by any public authority. However, the Constitution states that this freedom is conditional on nothing being taught or practiced that is contrary to public morality or public order. This means that religious practice must also respect the general rules that apply in society. Congregations or religious communities may employ their own religious leaders, such as priests, imams, rabbis, and so on. They may also build or adapt buildings for religious practice, such as churches, temples, synagogues, or mosques. As with all construction, permission must be obtained from the municipality to ensure that the building complies with local plans and regulations. Congregations or religious communities may also establish schools and may be permitted to set up burial grounds. Naturally, they may also make use of freedom of expression like everyone else, for example, by publishing religious texts. A religious community whose purpose is to gather around belief in powers, for example, a god, that transcend human beings and the laws of nature may be recognized as a religious community or congregation. Such recognition provides access to a number of special rights. In religious matters, this primarily means that the community's priest or other religious leader may be authorized to perform marriages. In 2025, there are a total of 436 recognized religious communities and congregations in Denmark. In addition to Christian communities, these include Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, and Hindu groups. Recognized religious communities and congregations do not receive direct financial support from the state. However, tax regulations provide various ways in which they may receive indirect support. The second largest religion in Denmark today is Islam, which comprises a number of different religious communities. Only membership in the folk church is registered by the authorities. Therefore, there are no official statistics on how many citizens belong to the various other religions, congregations, or religious communities in Denmark. 6.10 Customs and Special Days. Throughout the year, a number of public holidays, special days, and traditions are celebrated in Denmark. On many of these days, children have time off from school and adults have time off from work. Denmark is, incidentally, one of the only countries in the world that does not have an official national day. Fastelavn. Fastelavn is another word for carnival. It is a spring festival that can be traced back to ancient Rome and Egypt. In Denmark, Fastelavn originally marked the beginning of the fasting period in the Christian tradition. According to old custom, children dress up in costumes and hit a barrel. In the past, a live cat was placed inside the barrel, and the person who broke the barrel was called the Cat Queen or Cat King, a title that is still used today. Nowadays, the barrel contains candy and fruit. Fastelavn takes place 7 weeks before Easter. Easter. The Christian Easter celebrates that Jesus was crucified, died, and rose from the dead. In Denmark, Easter is often used for family gatherings. Traditionally, people give each other Easter eggs. The egg is an ancient symbol of fertility, and today, Easter eggs are often made of chocolate. There is also a tradition of eating lamb, as the lamb symbolizes Easter's message that Jesus was sacrificed as an innocent lamb for humanity's sins. Easter takes place each year in March or April. May 1st, International Workers' Day, is celebrated with marches, political speeches, and events throughout the country. These events are organized by the trade union movement and by political parties that originate from it, primarily the Social Democratic Party, the Socialist People's Party, SF, and the Red-Green Alliance, Enhedslisten. Pentecost. At Pentecost, Christians celebrate that the Holy Spirit, according to the Bible, came to earth. Pentecost originally marked the end of 7 weeks of celebration after Easter. Some people have the tradition of getting up early to watch the sun dance and of holding a Pentecost picnic, for example, by bringing a picnic basket into the forest. Pentecost takes place each year in May or June, 7 weeks after Easter. Constitution Day. June 5th is Constitution Day, when people gather and celebrate Denmark's democratic constitution, the constitutional act of the Kingdom of Denmark, with speeches. Denmark received its first constitution in 1849. Sankt Hans, Midsummer. On the evening of June 23rd, Sankt Hans is celebrated. The celebration of Sankt Hans Eve has its roots in a mixture of pagan folk tradition and Christianity. The festival marks midsummer, and according to old custom, bonfires are lit. The name Hans is a shortened form of Johannes, and in a Christian context, Sankt Hans marks the birthday of John the Baptist on June 24th. Christmas. At Christmas, the birth of Jesus is celebrated. Christmas Eve is December 24th, when families gather, eat together, and exchange gifts. Most people dance around the Christmas tree and sing Christmas hymns. Many also attend a Christmas church service. Christmas, therefore, has roots both in Christianity and in pagan folk tradition, marking the winter solstice, when daylight hours are shortest and the days begin to grow longer. December the 25th and 26th are called First and Second Christmas Day, when many families gather for Christmas lunches. New Year. New Year's Eve, December 31st, is the last day of the year. Parties are typically held and fireworks are set off all over the country. On New Year's Day, January 1st, most workplaces and shops are closed. Other holidays and special days. Increased cultural exchange around the world has also brought a number of other customs and special days to Denmark. Some of these are due to the growing number of Danes with foreign backgrounds. The Muslim fasting month of Ramadan is observed in Denmark, as is the Feast of Sacrifice, Eid al-Adha, which marks the end of the annual pilgrimage to Mecca and is one of the most important Islamic holidays. The most important holy day in the Jewish year is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is used for personal spiritual purification, offering an opportunity to let go of old conflicts, ask for forgiveness, repent one's sins, and make amends through prayer and fasting. Some people also celebrate Halloween on October 31st, as in the United States. Children dress up as witches, ghosts, or similar figures, and lanterns are made from hollowed-out pumpkins. In several places around the country, Carnival is also celebrated following South American traditions, with costumes, samba music, and parades. The largest carnival is held in Copenhagen during Pentecost. 6.11 NFS Grundtvig, Danish Identity, Folk High Schools, and Church Life. The priest hymn writer and public intellectual Nikolai Frederick Severin Grundtvig, 1783 to 1872, became a central figure in the development of thought, culture, and civic life in Denmark during the 19th century. His ideas have also had a very strong influence on modern Danish self-understanding. Grundtvig was a theologian and worked for most of his life as a priest, but his extensive engagement in public life and his ideas about what it meant to be Danish came to play a decisive role throughout the 19th century in shaping the national consciousness of the general population, that is, the shared understanding of what it means to be Danish. In other words, what today is often referred to as Danishness, danskhed. He lived at a time when Denmark, following the loss of Norway, 1814, and Schleswig and Holstein, 1864, became a small state. At the same time, the country gained a more homogeneous population in which almost everyone spoke Danish. This created the foundation for a society with strong social cohesion and was of crucial importance for Grundtvig's ideas. The popular became the national. Grundtvig gave much thought to how a population that had previously obeyed the king's decisions without resistance could become competent and equal citizens. Central to Grundtvig's thinking was the concept of the popular, folkelied, meaning that he took his point of departure in the people, ordinary men and women, rather than, as before, the elites, such as landowners, academics, or the wealthy bourgeoisie. This formed the basis of all his thinking. For Grundtvig, folkelighed was a positive concept that should be central to everything, laws, rules, institutions, and behavior, and should therefore be based on the culture, way of life, and worldview of the broad population, especially rural society. Through broad-based education and enlightenment, everyone was to become part of a great national community. In this way, social groups that had previously understood themselves as quite separate could be brought together into a unified people, a nation. The folk high school. Grundtvig's ideas also formed the foundation of the folk high school movement. According to Grundtvig, the folk high school should be different from existing schools and universities. Students were not to memorize facts or take exams. Instead, teaching should be based on the living word. Students were to learn curiosity and discussion. At folk high schools, people were to learn for life and receive broad enlightenment in subjects such as Danish history, literature, and natural science. In this way, they could become competent citizens, responsible both for themselves and for society as a whole. Important elements of folk high school life were lectures and communal singing. Since 1894, the folk high school songbook, Højskolesangbogen, has been published in many editions. It contains numerous patriotic songs and hymns, many of which were written by Grundtvig himself. The folk high schools were primarily aimed at young men and women from rural areas. In Grundtvig's view, they had a particular need for education that could awaken their natural curiosity and joy in life, thereby developing them into active and engaged citizens. The first Grundtvig-inspired folk high school opened in 1844 in Rødding in southern Jutland, and many more soon followed throughout the country. Here, young people from the countryside could spend a winter gaining inspiration for an active future life in their local communities. This improved education of the rural population through folk high school stays was one of the factors behind the great success of the cooperative movement in the late 19th century. The importance of the folk high school movement declined with industrialization. During the 20th century, agriculture gradually lost importance. Migration from countryside to city accelerated, and the traditional school system expanded. Today, folk high schools primarily attract young people from urban areas who, after completing upper secondary education, wish to develop personally before beginning higher education. Many modern folk high schools have gradually become specialized theme schools, focusing, for example, on elite level sports or music. In this way, they have moved somewhat away from Grundtvig's original idea of the folk high school as the core of general popular education. Grundtvig and the National Church. Grundtvig also had a great influence on Danish church life. He gave his name to the dominant current within the Danish National Church, Grundtvigianism, which is based on a non-dogmatic understanding of Christianity with an emphasis on joy in life. Grundtvig first formulated his view of Christianity in 1832 with a phrase typical of him, human first, Christian second. It is also largely due to Grundtvig that the prefix folk appears in many Danish terms, such as Folketing, Parliament, Folkehøjskole, folk high school, Folkeskole, public school, and Folkebibliotek, public library. Grundtvig was also a member of the Constituent Assembly that drafted Denmark's first democratic constitution, which came into force on June 5, 1849. Largely because of his efforts, the Danish church never became a state church. The modern Danish church is a national church that is supported by the state, but otherwise carries out its functions according to rules set by the church itself. This is fully in line with Grundtvig's ideas of folkeligt, which also underpin the way the Danish nation understands itself. Grundtvig's hymns and songs. Alongside his church and political work, Grundtvig was Denmark's most prolific writer of patriotic songs and hymns. Over the course of his long life, he wrote more than 1,500 songs, many of which are still found in the Folk High School Songbook and the Danish Hymn Book. At nearly all Danish church weddings, the hymn, Det så yndet at følges ad, It is so lovely to walk together, is sung, and every New Year, shortly after midnight, many people drink champagne and eat marzipan wreath cake to the hymn, Vær velkommen, Herrens år, Welcome, O Year of the Lord, both written by Grundtvig. 6.12 Schooling and Education in Denmark. The education system is part of the foundation of Danish society. First and foremost, education provides citizens with knowledge and skills that are valuable in working life. One of the most important reasons for a society's economic prosperity and for an individual's income is closely linked to the acquisition of knowledge that can be used in the labor market. The labor market in a wealthy country such as Denmark, therefore, places high demands on citizens in terms of education and competence. This applies both to basic skills such as being able to read and write Danish, do mathematics, and speak English or other foreign languages, and to more specific skills, both practical and academic/theoretical, depending on the type of education. In addition, education is important because it gives citizens shared knowledge, identity, and the ability to understand their everyday lives and society. The history of the Danish education system dates back to the Middle Ages. In 1479, the University of Copenhagen opened as the country's first university. Even older, however, are the Latin schools, which emerged around the year 1200 in connection with cathedral churches. The term Latin school was used until 1903 for many of the schools that prepared young people for university. After the Reformation in the 16th century, children were taught Martin Luther's Small Catechism, a handbook of the Christian faith. Teaching was carried out by the local priest or the parish clerk, the priest's assistant. Children often attended school only 1 or 2 days a week. In the 18th century, a number of schools were established. From the end of the century, teacher training colleges were founded, responsible for educating teachers. The foundation of the Danish public school, Folkeskole, was laid with the School Act of 1814, which standardize rules for teaching throughout the country. There is no compulsory schooling in Denmark, but there is a 10-year compulsory education requirement. This means that all children must receive education for 10 years. Parents are free to choose between the public folkskole, private schools, or homeschooling. However, the requirement is that the child must reach the same academic level as in the public school if taught at home or in a private school. Although there is no compulsory school attendance, almost 100% of Danish children attend school. The folkskole consists of a 1-year preschool class, often called grade 0, and a 9-year compulsory school program. There is also the option of an additional year in grade 10. According to the Public School Act, the folkskole has the following objectives. In cooperation with parents, the folkskole must provide pupils with knowledge and skills that prepare them for further education and give them a desire to learn more, make them familiar with Danish culture and history, give them an understanding of other countries and cultures, contribute to their understanding of the interaction between humans and nature, and promote each pupil's all-round personal development. The folkskole must develop teaching methods and create opportunities for experience, immersion, and initiative, so that pupils develop insight and imagination and gain confidence in their own abilities, providing a basis for forming opinions and taking action. The folkskole must prepare pupils for participation, shared responsibility, rights and duties in a society based on freedom and democracy. The work of the school must therefore be characterized by freedom of thought, equality, and democracy. All subjects are taught jointly to girls and boys, and pupils are usually taught together in the same class throughout the entire school course. Schools cooperate closely with parents who can influence their child's schooling by becoming members of the school board and by participating in parent meetings. Pupils have the right to form a student council and to elect at least 2 representatives to the school board, where they sit alongside parent representatives, staff representatives, and the school leadership. From grade 0 through grade 7, pupils do not receive grades. From grade 8 onward, however, pupils receive grades in a number of subjects at least twice a year. After grades 8 and 9, pupils take examinations in many subjects. After grade 10, pupils may also take examinations in several subjects. Examinations can be both oral and written. The grading scale used in Denmark is called the 7-point grading scale because it consists of 7 grades. There are 2 failing grades, -3 and 0, and 5 passing grades, 0, 2, 4, 7, 10, and 12. The highest grade is 12, and the lowest is -3. The 7-point grading scale is used throughout the Danish education system. Continuing education after the 10 years of compulsory education is voluntary. However, the Danish labor market increasingly demands education and skills, so 10 years of schooling is not sufficient for most jobs. All citizens in Denmark have access to many different types of education, and the vast majority of educational programs are free of charge. Most young people in Denmark continue with one of the many upper secondary education programs after compulsory schooling. This applies to both genders. Upper secondary education may be oriented toward vocational careers or further education. A vocational education may, for example, be within commerce, office work, or skilled trades. Within the social and health sector, one can train as a child care assistant or a social and health care assistant. There are several types of upper secondary programs that provide access to higher education, including the General Upper Secondary School, STX, the Commercial Upper Secondary School, HHX, the Technical Upper Secondary School, HTX, and the Higher Preparatory Examination, HF. Higher education varies in length, depending on the field of study. Programs may be short, 2 to 3 years, medium length, 3 to 4 years, or long, 5 to 6 years. Short cycle higher education can lead to qualifications such as laboratory technician, computer scientist, AP degree, or construction technician. Medium cycle programs include education as a pedagogue, journalist, teacher, or nurse. Long cycle higher education typically consists of university programs within natural sciences, health sciences, social sciences, or the humanities. Admission to medium and long cycle higher education normally requires an upper secondary education, but in some cases, vocational qualifications may also provide access. There are also many opportunities for continuing and further education for adults in Denmark. This is often referred to as lifelong learning. People may pursue education if they want a new job in a different field from their original training, or if new technologies at their workplace require special skills. Adults can take vocational education or courses at vocational schools. They may also take final examinations in individual subjects at folkskole level or HF level at adult education centers, VUC. In addition, it is possible to pursue supplementary continuing education at universities, for example, a master's degree. And there are also special educational programs for adults with reading or spelling difficulties. Longer periods of education. In recent decades, there has been a significant increase in the length of time the Danish population spends in the education system. Many more students now attend academically oriented programs, while far fewer choose practical ones. In 1982, 36% of a cohort completed an upper secondary academic education. This had risen to 72% by 2023. Conversely, the proportion choosing vocational education declined from 36% to 19% over the same period. There has also been a large increase in the number of people completing long cycle higher education. In 1990, about 6,000 students completed a master's degree. In 2002, the number was about 10,000, and in 2024, about 23,000 students completed a master's degree. There is broad agreement that it is generally positive that most people continue their education beyond compulsory schooling. However, this development has also led to debates about the structure of the education system. For example, there's a shortage of skilled manual labor, such as cooks, carpenters, and electricians, leading to discussions about whether too many young people choose academic upper secondary education and too few choose vocational schools. Another challenge is that in some higher education programs, too many graduates struggle to find employment after completing their studies. At the same time, too few choose programs such as pedagogy, nursing, or technical and natural science fields such as engineering or computer science. As a result, various initiatives have been introduced to encourage more students to choose programs that the labor market needs most. For example, in 2014, Denmark introduced so-called unemployment-based dimensioning, which sets a cap on the number of students admitted to programs where there has been high unemployment among graduates over a period of time. This applies especially to fields within the humanities and parts of the social sciences, such as art history, anthropology, philosophy, or musicology. More practical learning in primary and upper secondary education. Partly due to the shortage of skilled manual labor, Danish education policy has undergone significant changes in recent years, affecting both the folkskole and upper secondary education. Regarding the folkskole, a majority in the Danish parliament agreed in 2024 that theory and practical training should be more closely integrated into teaching. Specifically, all pupils in the upper grades will in the future complete 5 days of work placement at a workplace. There will also be an option for so-called junior apprenticeships, allowing pupils in grades 8 and 9 to attend school 3 days a week and spend the remaining 2 days working and training in a local company. In addition, more practical elective subjects will be offered to older pupils, and technological understanding will be integrated throughout the entire Volksskole curriculum. In 2025, reforms were also introduced at the upper secondary level. From 2030, a new vocational and profession-oriented upper secondary education, EPX, will be established. In EPX, students will encounter a combination of practical and academic teaching, with close cooperation with local businesses. Therefore, upper secondary schools offering EPX will have workshops and laboratories where students can acquire practical skills. At the same time, admission requirements for the general upper secondary school will be tightened, which is expected to result in fewer students enrolling in the future. 6.13 Family and family life. The family has undergone major changes in Denmark over the past 100 years. Especially since the 1960s, families have been influenced by new cultural trends and forms of cohabitation, where the family, the nuclear family, previously almost always consisted of a man and a woman who were married and their children. Today, there are many other family types: unmarried cohabiting couples with or without children, same-sex couples who are married or live in registered partnerships, single parents with children, and single adults without children. Marriage between a man and a woman is still the most common form of cohabitation and accounted for 73% of all cohabiting couples in 2025. However, the proportion of people who marry has declined significantly over the years. For example, in 1970, 88% of all 30-year-old women were married, whereas in 2025, the proportion was only 31%. At the same time, both men and women are older than before when they marry for the first time. This does not mean, however, that people wait to form couples. Since the 1970s, it has been common, especially among younger people, for couples to live together even if they are not married. Couples who live together without being married, paperless marriages, do not automatically have the same legal and financial obligations toward each other as married couples. In Denmark, there's an aim for homosexual people to have the same rights and duties as all other citizens. This has not always been the case. Until 1933, sexual relations between people of the same sex could be punished with fines or imprisonment, and only in 1981 was homosexuality removed from the Danish Health Authority's official list of mental illnesses. In 1989, Denmark became the first country in the world to grant two people of the same sex the right to enter into a registered partnership with almost the same legal effects as marriage. Since 2012, same-sex couples have been able to marry, including in the Danish National Church. The Netherlands was the first country in the world to introduce this right in 2001. Since 2010, same-sex couples have also been allowed to adopt. It has also become more common than before for adults to live alone. The number of single adults over the age of 18 has increased sharply. In 2024, 55% of all adults lived alone, meaning that they were neither married nor living with a partner. The growing share of adults living alone is partly related to the fact that divorce has become more common, but it is also influenced by the increasing number of elderly people where one spouse has died. Danish society is based on respect for the individual. This means that men and women have the same rights in political and economic life and in family life, including the right to form a family, to divorce, and so on. Children also have rights, even though they are under the age of legal majority. The age of majority in Denmark is 18. For example, children under the age of 13 are not allowed to work outside the home. Parents are not allowed to hit their children. Children who are subjected to violence by their parents or who are otherwise mistreated may be removed from their homes by the authorities and placed in foster care with another family. When children turn 18 and thus reach the age of majority, they are free to choose how they want to live their lives and with whom. This includes the right to marry. A man and a woman who wish to marry may enter into marriage in Denmark under certain conditions. Among other things, both must have legal residence in Denmark and be at least 18 years old. Marriages in Denmark can only be entered into on a voluntary basis. It is therefore a criminal offense to attempt to force someone into a marriage they do not wish to enter. A spouse, whether the woman or the man, who does not wish to continue the marriage, has the right to a separation of 6 months and thereafter the right to a divorce. If the couple agrees that they want to divorce, they can obtain a divorce immediately. If they do not agree, one spouse has the right to an immediate divorce when special circumstances apply, such as infidelity or violence. In a marriage, the mother and father have joint parental authority over their shared children. After a divorce, parents continue to share joint parental authority over the children. If parents separate, they decide themselves how to divide responsibility for their shared children. If one parent wants sole parental authority, it is the courts that decide whether joint parental authority should continue or whether one of the parents should be granted sole parental authority. Many children alternate living with both parents and may gain new parents, step-parents, and siblings if their parents marry or move in with new partners. 6.14 Discrimination, Anti-Semitism, Hate Crimes, and Extremism. Denmark is built on ideals such as freedom and democracy. These ideals are enshrined in Denmark's constitution, the Constitutional Act. The Constitution, for example, states that people are free to say or write what they wish, freedom of expression. It also guarantees the right to choose one's religion, freedom of religion. In addition, the Constitution protects the right to form associations, freedom of association, and to assemble, for example, for demonstrations, freedom of assembly. However, it is illegal to misuse these freedoms in certain ways, specifically through discrimination. Discrimination occurs when people are treated differently and worse because of their faith, political beliefs, skin color, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, and so on. It is often said that freedom must be exercised with responsibility. In general, ideals of equality and democracy enjoy strong support in Denmark, but there are also examples of discrimination. Studies suggest that nearly half of all citizens in Denmark with a non-Western immigrant background have experienced discrimination in one form or another because of their ethnic origin. Research shows that applicants with certain foreign-sounding names have more difficulty obtaining rental housing or being invited to job interviews, even when they are just as qualified as applicants with typically Danish names. It is also illegal to publicly say or write anything that demeans, insults, or threatens others because of, for example, their race, skin color, religion, or sexual orientation. Likewise, it is illegal to use freedom of expression to publicly incite criminal acts, for example, by encouraging violence against a specific group of people. It is also illegal to publicly express clear support for a terrorist attack that has already been carried out. Many of these rules are designed to protect religious, ethnic, and sexual minorities from abuse by the state and from abuse by other citizens. To protect minorities, crimes may be punished more severely if they are committed because of the victim's ethnic origin, religion, sexual orientation, or similar characteristics. Such crimes are known as hate crimes. Between 2017 In 2022, the Danish police registered 3,107 cases of hate crimes. Of these, 1,709 cases, 55%, were motivated by the victim's race or ethnicity, 893 cases, 29%, by the victim's religion, and 516 cases, 17%, by the victim's sexual orientation. The crimes typically involved hateful speech, violence, vandalism, or threats. This corresponds to an average of 517 hate crimes per year during the period, more than one case per day. The Jewish minority in Denmark is an example of a group that is particularly exposed to hate crimes. Between 2017 and 2022, the police registered 337 hate crimes against Jews. This is a high number, considering that there are only about 6,000 to 8,000 Jews living in Denmark. More than 1/3 of all hate crimes committed in Denmark on the basis of religion, and more than 1/10 of all hate crimes overall, were directed at Jews. For example, gravestones at a Jewish cemetery in Randers were vandalized with paint and knocked over in 2019 by men from a neo-Nazi movement. This occurred symbolically on November 9th, the anniversary of Kristallnacht in 1938, when Nazis destroyed and burned Jewish shops, synagogues, homes, and schools in Germany. After the conflict between Israel and Hamas began in October 2023, Jewish citizens in Denmark have increasingly experienced threats and harassment. Much of this has taken place online, for example via social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and X, where they have been held responsible for Israel's policies toward the Palestinians. In several cases, this has involved hateful comments and Nazi symbols such as the swastika. On May 5th, 2023, the anniversary of Denmark's liberation in 1945, a memorial stone in Copenhagen commemorating the Danes' help to Danish Jews during World War II was splashed with red paint. The most serious example of an anti-Semitic act in Denmark in recent times is probably the terrorist attack in 2015, when a terrorist with sympathies for the terrorist organization Islamic State shot and killed a Jewish security guard. This happened when the terrorist unsuccessfully attempted to enter a synagogue in central Copenhagen. There are also examples of hate crimes against other groups. For instance, in 2020, a Danish party leader was convicted for stating in a video that Danes and Denmark are far too highly developed and advanced to coexist with the very inferior Muslim cultural waste. In 2017, a man was convicted of spitting on and punching a homosexual man in the head on a train. In 2015, Nazi graffiti containing threats was painted, and a car was set on fire at an asylum center by a perpetrator who opposed Denmark's refugee policy. The perpetrator was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison. In other cases, crimes are committed because perpetrators dislike the victim's political views. In 2003, then Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen and Foreign Minister Per Stig Møller were attacked with paint in the Danish parliament, the Folketing, because Denmark supported the United States invasion of Iraq, the Iraq War. The two perpetrators were sentenced to 3 and 4 months in prison, respectively. The courts considered it particularly serious that representatives of democracy had been attacked. In recent decades, the Danish Security and Intelligence Service, PET, has had to provide an increasing number of politicians with bodyguards, as PET assesses that more politicians are at risk of attacks or harassment. 6.15 Gender Equality. Equality between men and women is today one of the core values of Danish society. This has not always been the case. There are still challenges, but there has clearly been much greater equality between the two sexes in Denmark over the past 150 years. This is due in large part to the women's movement's struggle for women to have the same rights as men and to change society's traditional views on gender roles. For example, whether men should have authority over women or whether women can have sexual relationships before marriage. One thing is that men and women have largely obtained equal rights and duties in society. Another is that men and women still fare differently in a number of important areas. Equal pay. One of the most important issues in the struggle for gender equality has been the fight for equal pay. In 1914, men working in industry or crafts earned an average of 55 øre per hour, while women earned only 30 øre. Female teachers, until 1919, had to make do with 2/3 of the salary of male teachers. Wage differences between men and women have gradually decreased over the past 100 years. A milestone was reached in 1976 when the Danish parliament, the Folketing, following requirements from the EEC, now the EU, passed a law on equal pay for equal work. However, some inequality remains. In 2022, women earned on average 12% less than men in hourly wages across the entire labor market. Calculations that take into account differences between women's and men's education, work experience, sector, and job function typically show an hourly wage gap of 4 to 7%. The narrowing of the gap is mainly due to the fact that men have fallen behind women in terms of education over recent decades. Both genders are better educated than before, but the development has benefited women the most. In 1960, about 5% of women and 16% of men in a given cohort completed a higher education above upper secondary level. In 2023, the figures were about 64% of women and 45% of men. There are also more female managers today, although they are still in the minority. In 2022, women made up 31% of managers in the Danish labor market. At the highest management levels, however, the share is lower. Women account for 19% of board members and 16% of CEOs. There is, however, a significantly higher share of female managers in the public sector than in the private sector. A large part of the remaining wage gap is due to the fact that there are still more male managers and that men and women work in different occupations. Wage differences between occupational groups in the public sector were determined more than 50 years ago, at a time when society viewed the two sexes as less equal than today. As a result, some traditional female occupations, for example, preschool teachers and social and healthcare assistants, are placed significantly lower than typical male occupations, for example, police officers. There is, however, disagreement about exactly how much remains before there is truly equal pay for equal work, since in practice it is difficult to assess when work is truly the same. That is, exactly what value different occupational groups and individual employees create. Parental leave. Another important issue related to equality concerns parental leave. In 2002, the current legislation was introduced, providing a total of 52 weeks, 4 weeks before and 14 weeks after birth for the mother, and 2 weeks for the father in connection with the birth. The remaining 32 weeks of parental leave can be freely shared between the parents. In practice, however, women still take the vast majority of the leave, on average about 80%, while men take about 20%. This difference means that women, due to their absence from the workplace, do not increase their wages as much as men do. Conversely, men spend less time with their children. Some of this imbalance is expected to change in the future. From August 2022, based on an EU directive, new rules were introduced requiring fathers to take at least 11 weeks, about 2.5 months, of parental leave. Sexual harassment. In 2017, a new international movement spread via social media under the hashtag #MeToo. The movement targeted sexual harassment and abuse. It began with a series of accusations by women in the American film industry about sexual misconduct. There turned out to be many such cases. The movement quickly spread to many countries, where women publicly shared that they too had experienced similar situations. In Denmark, the movement truly gained momentum in 2020 after TV host Sophie Linde, during a televised comedy awards gala, spoke not about comedians, but about her own experiences with sexual harassment and abuse in the television industry. This became the spark that ignited a major debate. Many people had similar experiences, especially in the media, film, music, cultural sectors, and in politics. This led to prominent politicians being forced to resign and well-known media figures losing their jobs. Sexual harassment and abuse also occur in many other sectors, but are less visible when they take place in less high-profile professions. These can include shop assistants, social and healthcare assistants, or nurses. When harassment is committed by managers or people in senior positions, it also involves power, because employees, out of fear for their careers, may find it difficult to speak up. For this reason, trade unions have also focused on sexual harassment. One result has been that many workplaces are working to change workplace culture, make it easier for employees to report offenders, and impose stricter consequences when harassment occurs. In 2021, a consent-based rape law came into force. Its purpose is to better protect individuals against unwanted sex. Under the previous law, rape was defined as cases involving violence, threats of violence, or other unlawful coercion, or if intercourse took place when the victim was unable to say no, for example, due to unconsciousness. Under the new law, rape can also be punished if intercourse takes place without the consent of both parties, even if no violence or threats were used. Consent does not require both parties to explicitly say yes. Consent to sexual intercourse can be expressed through both words and actions. 6.16 Health and the healthcare system. Health is one of the areas that voters consider most important. The healthcare system is also the area, second only to transfer payments, on which the public sector spends the most money in Denmark. In 2024, healthcare accounted for 9.4% of Denmark's total economy, and expenditures have grown rapidly in recent decades. This increase is partly due to an aging population, but above all, it is because technological advances continually provide more and better, yet also more expensive options for treating diseases. Health in a historical perspective. By the mid-1800s, average life expectancy was only about 40 years, and a large share of the population died in childhood. Since then, public health has improved significantly. Danes now live much longer. Life expectancy in 2023 to 2024 is 83.7 years for women and 79.9 years for men. Another result of improved health is that people have become much taller. Since the mid-1800s, average height has increased from about 165 centimeters for men and 155 centimeters for women to 180 centimeters for men and 167 centimeters for women. Improved health is due to several factors that truly began to take hold in the 1800s. First, far more food can be produced, ensuring that everyone has enough to eat and can better resist disease. Second, medical science has advanced greatly. Science now knows much more about bacteria, viruses, and other causes of illness, and therefore also about how diseases can be prevented and treated. Third, hygiene has improved with developments such as underground sewer systems, running drinking water, toilets, and healthier housing. There is also greater general awareness of how important good hygiene is for preventing disease. Fourth, a healthcare system has been built in which all citizens have access to doctors and hospitals. Copenhagen Municipal Hospital, built 1858 to 63, was one of Denmark's first modern hospitals. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, more than 100 hospitals were built across Denmark. From 1893, the state subsidized sickness funds, which were insurance schemes covering illness. By paying a fixed contribution, members could have expenses, such as visits to a general practitioner, covered. The sickness funds existed until 1973, when they were replaced by a fully public system, public health insurance. Changes in the disease profile. The societal development that has made us much wealthier over just a few generations has not only enabled better treatment and eradicated many diseases associated with undernutrition, it has also enabled people to eat much more fatty and sugary foods and to smoke and drink more alcohol. As in many other countries, this has led to a major increase in so-called lifestyle diseases in Denmark, diseases for which risk increases due to the way people live. These include, for example, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and COPD. This change in lifestyle is also reflected in the fact that the share of citizens who are severely overweight has risen from 5 to 6% in 1987 to 19% in 2023. Lifestyle diseases are also a key reason why, despite most healthcare being free, there is still social inequality in health. Unhealthy lifestyles are closely linked to social factors, especially education level. More people with short education smoke, eat unhealthily, or do little or no exercise. Conversely, somewhat more people with long education, especially among those over 65, drink large amounts of alcohol. Overall, however, people with short education have a higher risk of developing various diseases and of dying relatively early compared with those with long education. Unskilled workers, for example, live on average 5 to 7 years less than academics. A number of laws have been adopted to encourage healthier living. For example, one must be at least 16 years old to buy beer in shops with an alcohol content between 1.2 and 6%, and 18 years old to buy cigarettes, strong beer, wine, and spirits with an alcohol content of 6.6% and above. In nightlife zones, one must also be at least 18 years old to buy alcohol after 10 p.m. Smoking is the single largest cause of disease and death in Denmark. About 16,000 people die each year as a result of smoking, more than 1 in 4 deaths nationwide. To reduce smoking, it has been banned indoors in public places, that is, places open to everyone, such as public transport, sports halls, and cinemas. Smoking is also banned at workplaces and schools, and in the vast majority of restaurants, cafes, bars, and nightclubs. Pupils in primary schools and youth education programs, such as upper secondary schools and vocational schools, are prohibited from smoking during school hours, even outside school premises. In addition, cigarettes and other tobacco products must be kept out of sight in shops. In 2019, a political majority agreed to raise the price of a pack of cigarettes from about 40 Danish krone to 55 krone in 2020, and further to 60 krone in 2022. In recent years, there has also been increased focus on mental health and mental disorders. The Danish Health Authorities Survey. The National Health Profile shows that overall, the Danish population has good mental health. However, an increasing number of Danes over 16 report poor mental health, from 10% in 2010 to 17.4% in 2021. This trend is particularly evident among young people aged 16 to 24. Among women in this age group, the share reporting poor mental health rose from 15.8% to 34.4%, and among men from 8.3% to 21.1% over the period 2010 to 2021. The Danish healthcare system. Denmark's 5 regions are responsible for operating the vast majority of the healthcare system. This includes hospitals, which are free for patients. The regions also grant all residents the right to free care from general practitioners and specialist doctors, as well as subsidies for, among other things, treatment by physiotherapists, dentists, psychologists, and for purchasing medicines at pharmacies. General practitioners, specialists, physiotherapists, dentists, psychologists, and others are self-employed, but they are fully or partly paid by the regions. Visiting one's general practitioner, the gateway to the healthcare system, is therefore free. Most citizens are registered with a fixed general practitioner, also known as their own doctor. In most cases, the GP completes the examination or treatment. Patients may also be referred to a specialist, such as a dermatologist, surgeon, gynecologist, or neurologist, or to a hospital if the GP deems it necessary. In recent decades, many hospitals have been closed in Denmark. Treatment has instead been consolidated at far fewer but larger hospitals. An important purpose of this consolidation is to achieve higher quality of care, as doctors and nurses gain greater experience and routine with complex treatments, and because large hospitals can better afford the latest and best equipment. However, this development has also caused dissatisfaction in parts of the population, as many towns have lost their local hospital and associated jobs, and because many people now live farther from a hospital. While hospitals and general practitioners are free, some parts of the healthcare system require patients to pay all or part of the cost themselves. For example, there are subsidies when purchasing prescription medicine, but patients must pay part of the cost up to a certain limit, co-payment. As a general rule, patients must also pay part of the cost when seeing a psychologist. However, subsidies are available for certain patients if they are referred by a doctor. For example, if they have been victims of a serious accident, have attempted suicide, or suffer from anxiety or depression. Dental care is free for children and young people up to and including age 21. After that, there are subsidies for certain examinations and treatments, but co-payments for dental care are generally high. Municipalities are also responsible for parts of the healthcare system, particularly caring for patients after hospital discharge and for disease prevention. Municipalities provide, among other services, care and rehabilitation after hospitalization, home nursing, treatment for alcohol and drug abuse, dental care for children and young people, social psychiatry, and preventive services, including smoking cessation support. Global warming, a global problem. The consumption of large amounts of energy through the burning of coal, oil, and gas, collectively called fossil fuels, in areas such as production and transport has been crucial to the major economic growth of the past 150 years. But it has also led to large emissions of CO2 and other so-called greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We speak of greenhouse gases and their greenhouse effect because these gases, like a greenhouse, allow the sun's rays to enter, while at the same time limiting how much heat can escape again. The more greenhouse gases there are in the atmosphere, the less heat is released back out. This affects the climate, causing global warming, which threatens to create more desert areas worldwide, more flooding, and more extreme heat. The consequence will be that people will find it harder to live in large parts of the world. It is more than 100 years since this greenhouse effect was discovered. At the time, people thought it would take thousands of years before it became a problem, but it turned out to happen much faster. Today, we know that emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases have already affected our climate. Compared with the period 1850 to 1900, the global climate has become more than 1 degree warmer. Historically, that is a major change in a little over 100 years. The pace has been especially rapid in recent decades, and the development appears likely to continue even faster. The UN predicts that by the end of this century, the climate will be 1.4 to 4.4 degrees warmer than it was in the period 1850 to 1900. In order for Denmark to help counter this development, a number of steps have been taken over recent decades to reduce Danes' greenhouse gas emissions. This has meant that Denmark's emissions have fallen by about 47% since 1990. But globally, greenhouse gas emissions have increased significantly over the same period because the world's population is growing quickly and more people have money to buy more. That requires more production, and thus more greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere. Denmark emits about 1,000th of the world's climate gases. The problem can therefore only be solved if other countries also reduce their emissions. International cooperation is therefore crucial. The world's countries, especially through the UN, have focused on solving the problem. A number of international agreements have been made, including the so-called Paris Agreement in 2015, which commits almost all countries to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions over the coming decades. In addition, there are EU agreements with higher ambitions than the Paris Agreement. Denmark's climate efforts. In recent years, climate has taken up a lot of space on Denmark's political agenda. In 2014, the Danish Council on Climate Change, Klimarådet, was established. It advises the government on climate issues, assesses the government's climate policy, and presents its own recommendations. In its advice, the Council must, among other things, focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in a way that does not cost citizens, businesses, and society too much money or too many jobs. In 2019, most political parties agreed on a new Climate Act. The Climate Act commits the government to reduce Denmark's greenhouse gas emissions by 70% by 2030 compared with 1990. In addition, the Climate Act also commits Denmark to achieve full climate neutrality by 2050, meaning Denmark must not emit more greenhouse gases than the country absorbs. Since the Climate Act was adopted, the Folketing and the government have agreed on a range of initiatives intended to help reach these goals. The path to achieving these goals is meant to go through the so-called green transition. The green transition is about moving away from black energy sources such as oil and gas, which emit many greenhouse gases, and switching to renewable green energy sources such as solar, wind, and hydropower. These sources are called renewable because they do not run out, and they are called green because they emit none or far fewer greenhouse gases than black energy sources. The development is moving in the right direction, even though there is still a long way to go. In 2023, about 50% of Denmark's energy consumption was covered by renewable energy, compared with 6% in 1990. Among renewable energy sources, wind power is particularly important in Denmark. Denmark has had onshore wind turbines since the 1970s, and in 1991 installed the world's first offshore wind farm, Vindeby, off the coast of Lolland. In 2023, wind turbines produced half of Denmark's electricity consumption. Since 2020, Denmark has taken a significant step toward expanding wind power even further. As the first country in the world, Denmark has decided to build two so-called energy islands to be constructed in the 2030s. One energy island will be located near Bornholm and will send electricity to both Zealand and Germany. The other will be built in the North Sea, about 80 kilometers off Jutland's west coast. The islands will collect electricity from offshore wind turbines and distribute it to the countries connected to the islands. This is intended to supply electricity to many millions of people in different European countries. In May 2025, Denmark decided to tender 3 gigawatts of offshore wind, distributed across 3 different offshore wind farms, 2 in the North Sea and 1 in Denmark's internal waters near Hesselø in the Kattegat. Together, these offshore wind farms will be able to deliver green electricity to 3 million households. Work is also being done both to make heating of houses, apartments, and more efficient, and to ensure that green energy is used for that heating. Over time, stricter requirements have been introduced for building insulation and related measures to reduce energy consumption, and public support is provided so homeowners can replace oil or gas boilers with heat pumps or district heating. Heat pumps use heat from, for example, the ground and the air and raise the temperature using electricity, while district heating is based on central heating plants that use, for example, biomass or large heat pumps. In addition, car taxes have been designed according to how much greenhouse gas the cars emit. The goal is for there to be many more cars that run on electricity, electric cars, rather than cars that run on petrol or diesel. Previously, Europe bought large amounts of oil and gas from Russia. Imports have been significantly reduced since Russia's attack on Ukraine in 2022, while interest in green energy has grown even more, because it can make Europe less dependent on Russian energy. Denmark has also agreed, together with several North Sea countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, the United Kingdom, Norway, and others, that many new wind turbines are to be built in the North Sea area toward 2050. The Green Tripartite Agreement. A share of greenhouse gas emissions also comes from agriculture, which makes up 60% of Denmark's land area. This makes Denmark one of the countries in the world where the largest share of land is cultivated farmland. Transforming agriculture is therefore also crucial for Denmark's climate efforts. For that reason, the government, the municipalities, and a number of business organizations, trade unions, and environmental organizations have entered into a cooperation called the Green Tripartite, Den Grønne Trepart. In 2024, the parties behind the Green Tripartite agreed on a large overall plan to create more nature in Denmark, cleaner water in lakes, streams, and the sea, and to transform agriculture so that it pollutes less. It has been agreed that about 15% of Denmark's agricultural land, corresponding to an area larger than Funen and Bornholm combined, will be converted back to nature by planting new forests and establishing new meadows and other natural areas. In this connection, it is especially important that so-called lowland soil is converted to nature. Lowland soil is farmland that lies low in wet, marshy areas, filled with dead plant remains that contain a lot of carbon, which is released when the soil is cultivated. Lowland soil makes up only 7% of Denmark's farmland, but is responsible for about half of agriculture's CO2 emissions. In several places, Denmark's coastal areas and fjords have been affected by oxygen depletion, that is, declining oxygen levels that make it harder for fish and other nature to live in the water. This oxygen depletion is due in particular to agricultural fertilization of fields. The agreement therefore focuses especially on converting agricultural areas that release nitrogen into vulnerable aquatic environments. In addition, the agreement means that Denmark, as the first country in the world, has chosen to introduce a direct tax on agriculture's CO2 emissions, the so-called CO2 tax, so that farmers must pay for CO2 emissions, especially from their cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, and other animals. The tax has sparked political debate and has, among other things, been criticized for pushing food production and jobs out of rural areas and out of Denmark. Others have criticized the tax for being too low to reduce CO2 emissions sufficiently,